Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Grace was born on a quiet Thursday morning in Abaddon, but there was nothing quiet about the world she came into. Her mother, Rosalind, always said Grace was a child born out of regret, though she never said it to her with compassion. It was always laced with venom, like acid poured slowly over an open wound. The walls of their two-room apartment in Okadu echoed not with lullabies or laughter, but with bitterness, resentment, and the low grumbling of poverty. The floor was cemented with cracks like a broken mirror, and the air often carried the scent of kerosene and frustration. Grace learned to walk between arguments and ducked her head when the yelling started, which was often. Her father had disappeared when she was 6. No note, no warning, just one day gone like morning mist. Some neighbors said he was tired of Rosalind's sharp tongue. Others said he found another woman in Abeokuta. Rosalind, on the other hand, said nothing. She just grew colder, like Abaddon nights during Harmattan, her anger spreading like dry season dust into every corner of the house. Grace was the one who carried the blame, like a scapegoat led silently through a market square. "You remind me too much of him," Rosalind would say while peeling yam, as though Grace had committed the crime of being born. Words, cruel and consistent, rained down on her every day, eroding her confidence before it even had time to root. While other children in the compound laughed freely, Grace was taught early that her laughter must be quiet, contained, and infrequent. Her mother didn't believe in praise. She believed in survival. So when Grace brought home good results from school, Rosalind would only scoff and say, "It's not a husband you'll marry with that paper." By the time Grace was 12, she no longer sought validation. She learned to live like a shadow, present but barely seen. School was supposed to be an escape, a place where the air didn't feel heavy with disappointment, but even that was a battlefield. Grace had a quiet beauty, nothing dramatic, but a softness that turned heads and stirred whispers. The boys in school sometimes teased her, sometimes admired her from a distance, but Grace never truly noticed. She walked like someone afraid to take up space, hunched slightly, eyes always on the ground. Teachers would occasionally ask her to speak up, but her voice never seemed to leave her throat completely. It hung there, timid, like a child knocking at a door that would never open. Her best friend, Amaka, moved away when they were in JSS 2, and after that, Grace stopped trying. She became the girl who was always in the library during break time, tracing her fingers across books she never borrowed. She liked the feeling of being around stories that didn't scream at her, stories where girls were loved, where mothers said kind things, where people listened. Her uniform was always neat, but her face held a sadness that no amount of powder could mask. Sometimes she would pause outside a shop on her way home to look at mannequins dressed in fine clothes, imagining herself as someone else entirely, a girl with a father who stayed, a mother who smiled, a house that didn't echo with curses. But imagination has its limits, and reality always found a way to pull her back. At home, Rosalind had a rule: no unnecessary noise, no visitors, no questions. Grace learned to tiptoe on tiled floors and speak only when spoken to, and even then, only with caution. Her thoughts became her diary, locked tight behind her lips. She could scream in her mind, cry in her dreams, but in the waking world, she was silence personified. There were days Grace wondered if she was truly alive or just a collection of responses trained to avoid conflict. She never cried in front of her mother. Rosalind considered tears a sign of weakness and would sneer, "Crocodile tears don't solve anything. You want pity? Go and fetch water instead." But Grace's tears had long dried up anyway. It was as though she had cried all her pain before her 12th birthday, and afterward, her body simply stopped producing sorrow. What replaced it was numbness. Not the kind that dulls pain, but the kind that swallows it whole. She would sometimes lie on her back at night, staring at the ceiling fan creaking overhead, pretending she was somewhere else, maybe Lagos, maybe even abroad, anywhere but here. Her dreams were modest, a small room of her own, a steady job, and peace. She wanted quiet, but not the suffocating kind she had grown used to. She wanted the type of quiet that didn't carry the weight of unspoken grudges and daily insults. But even dreams became hard to hold on to. There was always something to do, something to clean, someone to apologize to for simply existing. And Rosalind always found a reason to remind her of her insignificance. "If not for me, you wouldn't even be in school," she'd snap. "Better don't disgrace me in this compound." Grace would nod, eyes low, and return to her chores. It was a cycle she knew by heart, a rhythm of survival. But somewhere deep within her chest, a question quietly grew. Was this really all there was to life? That question stayed with her like an itch she couldn't reach, quietly refusing to disappear, even on days when she convinced herself she deserved nothing more than this. Grace turned 17 in silence. There was no cake, no card, not even a happy birthday. Just another day of errands, shouted instructions, and a scolding for returning late from the market. She didn't expect a celebration. Expectation was a luxury she couldn't afford. But that night, after finishing her chores, she sat by the tiny window in their room, watching the lights flicker in distant buildings. Somewhere out there, people were laughing, falling in love, dancing. The night air was thick with the smell of roasting suya and the buzz of passing okadas. And there she was, alone, invisible, unloved. That was the night something in her heart began to crack. It wasn't a loud break, more like the soft tearing of old fabric. She didn't know it yet, but that crack would one day let light in. She hadn't met Darren yet. That storm was still on the horizon. But her soul was already parched, dry and brittle, ready to be set aflame by even the smallest spark. She just wanted someone, anyone, to see her, to choose her, to speak to her like she mattered. She had no idea that the one who would notice her first would be the one who almost destroyed her entirely. But life, like a stubborn river, always finds its course, even if it has to break mountains along the way. Grace first noticed Darren one dry evening in Makola when the sun had sunk low behind the smoky rooftops, and the scent of burning firewood mingled with dust. She had gone to buy tomatoes from Mama Afuzat's kiosk after school, her faded school uniform clinging to her thin frame. Darren stood beside a motorcycle, leaning back with an easy arrogance, his shirt half-buttoned, revealing skin the color of bronze under firelight. She would never have looked twice if he hadn't whistled softly as she walked past. "Fine girl, you know, day smile," he called out, with that cocky grin that made her stomach flutter without her permission. She didn't respond, she never did with strangers, but that night, as she lay on her raffia mat, the memory of his voice lingered like smoke in her lungs. She'd never been called fine before, not sincerely, not with a tone that suggested admiration. The next day, she saw him again by the football field behind her school, talking to some of the senior boys. They all seemed to look up to him, like he was a king in worn-out sneakers. He was older, probably 21 or 22, with a voice that rolled like gravel and charm that oozed like warm honey. Darren didn't blend in. He stood out, the way a red hibiscus does in a field of green weeds. And when their eyes met again, this time she smiled, just a small one, but enough. That was all he needed. Over the next few days, he appeared more often, always seeming to be where she was, tossing casual greetings her way like breadcrumbs. Slowly, he carved a place into her world, not forcefully, but like rain soaking into dry soil. She didn't even notice she was changing until she caught herself daydreaming in class, his name scribbled absent-mindedly on the margin of her notebook. Their first real conversation happened outside the corner shop near her house. It was unplanned. She was buying bread, and he was leaning against the wall with his arms folded, as though the entire world owed him patience. "Grace, right?" he asked, even though she'd never told him her name. She looked up, startled. "I hear things," he said with a wink. She tried to hide her smile, but failed. He walked her home that evening, his pace slow, his tone gentle. He asked questions no one had ever bothered to ask. What did she like to draw? Who was her favorite teacher? Did she believe in dreams? And Grace, hungry for attention, starving for softness, answered them all. By the time they reached her gate, her heart was dancing like a masquerade drum. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, and from that day he did. Every day. He brought her groundnuts in white nylon, cracked jokes that made her laugh out loud for the first time in years, and told her she was special. "You're not like the other girls," he'd say. "There's something deep about you." She soaked in his words like thirsty earth under rain. When he held her hand for the first time, her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange newness of it all. In her mind, Darren became a rescuer, a soft pillow to rest her weary heart on. He was the first person who had looked at her and seen more than just silence. He saw potential, or so she thought. Her mother didn't approve, of course. Rosalind saw Darren's swagger and branded him trouble, but Grace, still quietly rebelling against years of emotional starvation, held on tighter. She'd waited her whole life for someone to see her. Now someone did. She wasn't going to let go so easily. The change in Darren was subtle, almost invisible at first, like smoke sneaking through a cracked window. It started with impatience, rolling his eyes when she stumbled on her words, sighing when she asked questions, snapping when she laughed at the wrong time. The first time he called her slow, she laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the look in his eyes was sharp, colder than usual. "Don't act like a baby," he added, and just like that, the air between them shifted. Soon after, he started to pick on how she dressed. "Why do you always wear these old skirts? Don't you have anything nicer?" he asked, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that she only wore what she had. He began deciding when she could come out, whom she could speak to, and what time she should return home. And Grace, still wrapped in the illusion of love, adjusted herself accordingly. She believed love meant sacrifice. She thought, maybe if she just tried harder, he'd go back to the sweet Darren from those first few weeks. So she gave excuses for his behavior. "He's just stressed," she'd whisper to herself. "He cares too much." But the comments kept coming, like needles in her skin, small but steady. "You're lucky I even tolerate your type," he'd say one minute. The next, he'd hold her close and whisper, "You know I love you, right?" That dance, of pain and apology, became their rhythm. He controlled her without shouting, manipulated her without hitting. Yet the bruises were there, just not on her skin. They bloomed in her heart, purple and heavy, and she carried them with the same silence she had learned at home. No one noticed. No one ever asked. And even if they did, Grace wouldn't have known how to explain it. To the outside world, Darren was the charming young man always walking her home. But to Grace, he was a storm wearing a lover's face. The first time Darren truly frightened her was the night she told him she couldn't meet up because she had to help her mother. He didn't yell. He didn't push. He simply stared at her with a smile that didn't touch his eyes and said, "You're already starting to behave like those useless girls who don't know how to treat a man." His voice was calm, but her spine stiffened. That night, he didn't call, and the silence choked her. The next day, he appeared with flowers, plastic ones, cheap and gaudy, but to Grace, they meant everything. "I'm sorry I snapped. I was just angry because I care too much," he said, brushing a finger across her cheek. She nodded, forgave him, and convinced herself again that he meant well. But the seed of fear had been planted. She began to measure her words carefully around him, second-guessing every sentence. She stopped talking to a few classmates he didn't like. She ignored messages from old friends. She even started avoiding eye contact with boys entirely. Darren became her compass, her mirror, her oxygen. Without him, she felt small again. And that's exactly how he wanted it. Her world started shrinking, bit by bit, until Darren became the center of it all, the sun she revolved around, even when he burned. Grace, who had once dreamed of freedom and soft love, now found herself caught in a maze of manipulation. But instead of running, she tightened her grip. Because when someone builds you up just to break you, you start believing you're safest in the rubble. The clouds that hovered over Enugu that Sunday afternoon looked swollen with secrets. The kind of weather that made people stay indoors and reflect. But for Grace, reflection had long become a dangerous thing. She had arrived in Enugu 2 days earlier, temporarily sent to live with her Aunt Chica, after one of Rosalind's unpredictable outbursts escalated into a full-blown war. Her mother's words still echoed in her head like an incantation. "One day, you'll see that no man will ever stay with someone like you." The irony was, Grace hadn't told Rosalind the full truth about Darren. She never had to. Mothers like hers didn't need facts to fashion weapons. They could cut with assumptions alone. Aunt Chica's one-bedroom apartment above a carpenter's shop was quieter, warmer. There were fresh curtains on the windows, a small fridge that hummed peacefully at night, and a couch that didn't creak when you sat on it. Yet, even surrounded by calm, Grace felt like she was tiptoeing through a forest of glass. Her body carried Darren's invisible fingerprints. Every manipulation, every twisted compliment, every moment of subtle punishment he had dished out under the guise of love. She hadn't heard from him in 2 days, and part of her was relieved, though another part panicked. What if he was punishing her with silence again? What if she had truly messed up by coming here? But it was Aunt Chica's kindness, plain and non-intrusive, that slowly helped her breathe. Unlike her mother, Chica didn't pry or probe. She simply asked if Grace had eaten, if she wanted to rest, and whether she liked her tea with or without milk. It was in that stillness that something fragile began to surface. Not strength, not yet, but awareness. And on the 3rd day, as Grace sat by the window watching raindrops draw crooked lines down the glass, that was when she met the man who would change the rhythm of her life without even knowing it. Noah didn't arrive with fanfare or charm. He walked past her the first time without a word, carrying a plastic folder under one arm and a paint-streaked bag over his shoulder. There was nothing remarkable about him, except perhaps the deliberate way he walked, like a man not in a hurry, yet not idling either. Grace only noticed him because he looked up at the same moment she did, and for a brief second, their eyes met. He didn't smile. He just nodded, and that nod settled in her chest like an unfamiliar warmth. 2 days later, he returned, this time to the shop beneath Chica's apartment. He was helping with a mural for a community project, she later learned. A large, colorful painting meant for the youth center wall 2 streets down. The design was bold, full of movement, and every evening, he painted with patience, layer by layer, unbothered by the curious children who gathered around. Grace, drawn to the quiet hum of creation, began watching from the corridor above. He noticed her but said nothing until one day, without looking up, he said, "You can come closer, you know. It's not a secret." She hesitated, then descended the stairs slowly, heart in her throat. Up close, the wall came alive with reds and yellows and blues, faces emerging from color, stories unfolding in every brushstroke. Noah passed her a spare brush, still not looking at her. "You paint?" he asked casually. She shrugged, unsure how to answer. She had sketched things as a child, little doodles on her notebooks, pencil lines that never went anywhere. "Everyone paints," he added, dipping his brush into blue. "Even if it's just with silence." That was the first time she smiled without thinking. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Like he wasn't trying to pull anything out of her. Like her presence was enough. What began as a shared wall became a daily ritual. Grace returned every evening, sometimes just to watch, sometimes to paint a section under his guidance. He never hovered, never instructed with authority. Instead, he asked questions like, "What does this color make you feel?" Or, "What story do you see in this face?" Questions that made her think instead of shrink. He wasn't just painting a wall, he was building a space, a sanctuary made of color and quiet understanding. It startled her, the ease with which she felt safe around him. She didn't have to explain herself. He never asked about the scar near her elbow, or why she flinched when someone raised their voice nearby. One evening, as they packed up their materials, Noah said, "You're not hiding. You're healing." She didn't reply, but the words lodged themselves deep, like seeds dropped into fertile soil. At night, Grace began drawing again. Her lines were shaky at first, hesitant. But the more she painted, the more she began to find something she thought she'd lost. Her sense of self. Not the self Darren had tried to shape with criticism, nor the one her mother had crushed with relentless comparison. This self was quieter, more aware. It spoke in brushstrokes and silence, in the way she chose her colors deliberately, like a woman rewriting her story with each page. Noah never crossed lines, never pushed. He simply gave her space, and in that space she started to breathe differently, like someone who had lived underwater for years and was only just realizing she didn't have to hold her breath anymore. The day Darren called her was the first time Grace didn't feel panic grip her throat. She had seen his name on the screen and waited, watched the phone ring until it stopped. Then he called again. This time she answered, not because she wanted to hear his voice, but because she needed to hear what it would sound like now. "So this is it?" he asked, voice laced with arrogance. "You run off to your aunt's house, and suddenly you forget who's always been there for you." She said nothing. Her silence unsettled him. "Don't play this game with me, Grace. You're not like them. You're mine." That last word, said with such entitlement, struck something inside her. Not fear, not sadness. Disgust. For the first time, she felt it fully. "I'm not yours," she said slowly. "I was never yours." There was silence on the other end. Then a scoff. "You think anyone else will want someone like you?" She didn't respond. She ended the call and blocked his number. Her hands trembled for several minutes afterward, but it wasn't fear that made them shake, it was adrenaline. Power. It was as if by speaking those 4 words, she had shattered a mirror she had been staring into for too long, one that reflected only what others had said she was. She opened her sketchpad that night and drew a girl standing on broken glass, light streaming through the cracks. The face looked familiar, but stronger. She slept with her window open that night, the cool breeze brushing against her skin like a promise she hadn't made yet, but knew she would keep. There was something different about the morning Grace woke up and didn't feel the heaviness of dread sink into her chest before her feet touched the floor. It wasn't dramatic, not like in the stories where people claimed to feel reborn overnight. It was a quiet shift, like the slow opening of a bud after a long rainy season. She walked to the small sink in the corner of Aunt Chica's kitchen, and stared at her reflection in the broken mirror taped to the wall. Her face looked the same, no magical glow, no thunderous transformation, but her eyes no longer looked lost. There was a steady clarity in them that hadn't been there before. She noticed that she wasn't flinching as much when someone knocked on the door unexpectedly or raised their voice too loudly in the compound. It surprised her how calm she had become. Not numb, not detached, but calm, like someone who had survived the storm and was now sitting at the edge of the water, watching the wreckage float by without the urge to swim back in. Her drawings had changed too. They used to be dark and closed off, filled with tight lines and empty shadows. But now they were wider, more open, filled with strange characters and wide skies. Noah had said nothing specific about them, but when he saw one of her sketches, he simply nodded and said, "You're starting to see the world differently." She hadn't responded. There was no need. His words had found their way to her chest and rested there. She had come to appreciate the spaces between his sentences as much as the words themselves. He was the first person she had known who never made her feel like silence was something to apologize for. In his presence, she didn't have to shrink to make room. She could just be. It was during one of the art sessions at the youth center that Grace found herself surrounded by a small group of children who had taken a liking to her. They called her Auntie Grace and followed her like baby chicks, eager to show her their messy drawings and colored pages. She had never seen herself as someone others looked up to. She was used to disappearing, fading into backgrounds, waiting to be forgotten. But these children didn't let her fade. They giggled when she walked in, begged her to check their sketches, and even competed over who got to sit closest to her during class. At first, she didn't know how to react. The attention felt strange, like a coat 2 sizes too big. But as the weeks passed, she began to ease into it. She started offering quiet suggestions, showing them how to blend colors gently, how to draw expressions on faces, how to keep trying even when their lines didn't come out right. It was subtle, the way she began to lead. Never loud, never forceful, just present and consistent. One afternoon, a little girl named Ifyinanya tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Auntie, were you always this happy?" Grace didn't know how to answer that. The question caught her off guard. Happy? The word had felt foreign for so long that she wasn't sure what it meant anymore. But as she looked around the room at the joyful chaos, the laughter, the paint-smeared hands, the hopeful eyes, she realized that while she might not have been happy before, she was at least no longer empty. And that was something. She smiled at Ifyinanya and said, "No, but I'm learning." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was true. That moment stayed with her long after the paint had dried and the children had gone home. It stayed with her even when she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of life outside her window. The next week brought something unexpected. Rosalind called. Grace had almost forgotten what her mother's voice sounded like over the phone. She stared at the screen for nearly a full minute before answering, her fingers stiff with hesitation. "Where have you been?" her mother asked immediately, her tone sharp, not concerned, just annoyed. "You ran off and left me to deal with people asking questions. You think you're grown now, ABI?" Grace didn't respond right away. She sat down on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the same voice that had ruled her life for so long. But this time it didn't hit the same. The words bounced off her, like stones thrown at a house with closed windows. "I just needed space," Grace said softly, and her mother scoffed. "From your own mother?" There was bitterness there, but no surprise. Rosalind had never been good at hiding her resentment. She went on for a while, talking about the cost of rice, how the neighbors were gossiping, how Grace had embarrassed her. But through it all, Grace didn't cry. She didn't shout back. She simply waited for the storm to pass. And when her mother finally paused, as if expecting her to apologize or beg, Grace said, "I'm doing okay here." There was silence. A long one. Then Rosalind replied, "You'll come back. You can't make it out there without me." Grace didn't argue. She just said goodbye and hung up. That night, she didn't cry. Instead, she drew a picture of a woman standing on a bridge, waving goodbye to the fire behind her. The woman was facing forward, her shadow stretching into the distance. For the first time, Grace realized that not every goodbye had to come with a fight. Sometimes it was enough to walk away without turning back. Noah noticed something different about her that week. He didn't say it outright, but she could tell. There was a slight shift in the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with concern, but with a quiet kind of pride. They sat together on the edge of the youth center wall one evening, watching the children run around in the orange glow of sunset. "You've changed," he said eventually, not turning to look at her. She smiled, picking at a dry leaf between her fingers. I guess I'm finally starting to believe I'm allowed to take up space, she said, half joking, half serious. He nodded, still facing the sky. You always were. You just forgot for a while. They sat in silence after that, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that carried more weight than any words. Grace looked at him, this strange, quiet man who had appeared in her life like a whisper, and wondered how someone could see her so clearly without ever trying to fix her. He wasn't trying to save her, and maybe that's why she trusted him. Because he didn't see her as broken, just rebuilding. And she was. Every day, in small, slow pieces, she was gathering herself again, not the version others wanted, but the one she was slowly learning to love. That night, she didn't need to draw. She didn't need to write. She simply lay in bed, staring at the shadows on the wall, feeling full, not with answers, not with certainty, but with something more powerful, quiet self-belief. The air in Eloreen carried a different kind of silence. Not the tense, biting quiet she had grown up with, nor the cautious one that once filled her chest when Darren's mood would shift without warning. This was a silence that wrapped itself around her gently, like a soft cloth placed over a bruised shoulder. She had arrived 2 weeks earlier to stay with an old friend of Aunt Chica's, an elderly woman named Mama Beezy, who ran a tailoring shop out of her compound. The change of location wasn't planned. One morning, Grace had woken up with a weight in her chest that refused to lift, and when Chica asked if she needed time away, she simply nodded. There had been no dramatic goodbyes, no tears. Just a packed bag and a quiet bus ride that gave her time to think. Eloreen greeted her with wide roads and slower voices, a pace that allowed her to pause and breathe between thoughts. Mama Beezy welcomed her without fanfare. You're here. That's enough, she'd said with a small smile, pressing a warm plate of rice into her hands that first night. Grace found work helping around the shop, cutting fabric, arranging zippers, cleaning up stray threads. It was ordinary work, but it anchored her. Each day folded into the next, and without the chaos of Enugu or the weight of Abaddon, she found herself adjusting to the rhythm of a life that didn't require her to constantly defend her existence. In this small corner of the world, no one asked about her past. No one needed her to explain herself. The silence here wasn't a void, it was a gift, and within it, something deep within her began to untangle. It was during one of those late afternoons, when the sun painted the sky with fading gold and the scent of starch and fabric floated in the air, that Darren showed up. He arrived with the same confidence he had always carried, as if the world owed him space wherever he entered. Grace didn't recognize the knock at first, 3 sharp taps on the wooden gate, but when she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Time didn't slow down, the sky didn't darken, and no dramatic soundtrack played. It was just Darren, standing there like no time had passed at all, wearing the same smile that used to make her heart skip. Only now it made her stomach twist. I've been looking for you, he said, as though she had gone missing and not deliberately walked away. We need to talk. She didn't move. She didn't invite him in. For the first time, she noticed how loud his voice sounded, how even his silence carried an expectation. How did you find me? She asked, voice steady. Does it matter? He replied, stepping closer. I'm here now. You can stop acting like a stranger. That old part of her, the one that had once craved his validation like air, began to stir. But she shut it down. She stepped back and said, Whatever you came to say it here. His expression shifted slightly, like someone being denied access to a room they used to own. You think you're better than me now? He asked, folding his arms. Is that what all this is about? She didn't answer. Not because she didn't have words, but because she finally understood that not every accusation deserved a response. He talked for a while, about how people like them were meant to stay together, how nobody else would understand her like he did. But the longer he spoke, the more distant his voice became, like a radio losing signal. When he paused, waiting for her to soften, to cry, to return to that version of herself that bent easily, she simply said, I don't belong to you. The words weren't loud, but they were final. Later that evening, Grace sat alone behind Mama Beezy's shop, watching the sky grow darker with each passing minute. She had expected to feel something stronger after Darren left, relief, pride, maybe even fear, but what she felt was stillness. It was like dust had finally settled in a room that had been stormy for too long. She leaned back against the wall and let the quiet wrap around her. The confrontation hadn't gone the way she had rehearsed it in her head over the months. There had been no shouting, no dramatic slaps or threats. Just a conversation that ended before it could become a battle. And that, in itself, was its own kind of victory. She remembered the way Darren had looked at her, the confusion in his eyes when he realized she wasn't the same girl he had left behind. There had been a flicker of something else too, fear maybe. Not of her, but of the version of her he no longer controlled. And that flicker gave her strength. She wasn't naive, she knew he might try to return again. But the door was shut now. Not just the physical one. The one inside her. The one he had entered years ago with compliments that had felt like flowers but turned out to be thorns. She didn't need to paint that scene. It was already etched in her bones. Instead, she picked up her sketchbook and began to draw a quiet street, with trees leaning in, as if whispering secrets to one another. In the center, a girl stood alone, not lonely, just alone. Her feet were planted. Her shoulders were relaxed. And her eyes looked straight ahead. 2 days after Darren's visit, Grace received an unexpected message from a neighbor in Abaddon. Rosalind had fallen ill. Nothing grave, nothing fatal, but enough to get the women in the compound talking. She day alone too much, the message said. No one to help her anymore. Grace stared at the message for a long time. A year ago, she would have packed her things immediately, heart pounding, guilt dragging her like chains. But now, her reaction was quieter. Not indifferent, she still felt something, but it was no longer the drowning weight of obligation. She called her mother, and this time Rosalind sounded different. Weaker, perhaps, or maybe just tired. They spoke in short sentences, careful like people stepping through a room full of broken glass. "So you're fine where you are," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Grace replied. "I am." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I didn't raise you to walk away," Rosalind muttered. "I didn't learn how to stay," Grace said. Neither of them spoke after that. When the call ended, she didn't cry. Instead, she walked to the market and bought new pencils. That evening, as she sat to draw, she thought of how some wounds don't heal cleanly. They scar, they harden, they linger. But even scars could live on skin that was still growing. She wasn't looking for her mother's approval anymore. She wasn't seeking closure from Darren. What she was learning slowly was that healing didn't always arrive like rain after drought. Sometimes it came like a sunrise, gradual, quiet, and undeniable. The first time Grace stood before a group of strangers to share her story, she didn't plan to say much. It was a warm afternoon in Eloreen, and the youth center had organized a community showcase for the children and volunteers. There were drums playing softly in the background, laughter from a corner where kids chased balloons, and a table filled with art, drawings, finger paintings, paper crafts, some vibrant, others clumsy, all brimming with life. Noah had encouraged her to show a few of her sketches, not to impress anyone, just to inspire. "Even if one child sees themselves in your work, it'll be worth it," he'd said, and she hadn't argued. That morning, she laid out 5 pieces, each one different, personal. One showed a girl in the rain, another showed broken hands reaching toward the sun, and the last one depicted a woman walking barefoot across a cracked path, her eyes closed but her steps steady. The children had already started crowding around the artwork, pointing, smiling, asking questions. But when the program host called her name and asked if she would like to speak, Grace hesitated. She wasn't afraid, not in the trembling, breathless way she used to be. But she was still unsure whether her voice belonged in a room full of confident, open people. Then she saw Ifeanyi among the children, waving enthusiastically, mouthing, "Auntie, talk now." That simple gesture settled something inside her. She took slow steps to the front, held the microphone gently, and cleared her throat. Her voice was soft at first, but the words came, shaped by truth, not performance. "I used to think being quiet meant I had nothing to say," she began. "But sometimes, silence is where people go to protect the parts of themselves no one else has seen." The crowd quieted. There were no dramatic claps, no gasps, just stillness. And in that stillness, Grace told pieces of her journey. Not the entire tale, but enough. Enough to let others know that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through a shaky breath and still stands tall. In the weeks that followed, Grace continued living with more intention. She began waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but because she enjoyed the quiet hours before the rest of the world stirred. She would sit outside on a low stool, sip warm tea from a chipped mug, and listen to the hum of the neighborhood, the sweeping brooms, the sputtering of a generator, the occasional crow of a distant rooster. Life had not transformed into a fairy tale. She still had to budget tightly, stretch meals creatively, and deal with occasional waves of doubt that crept in without warning. But the difference now was her response. She no longer questioned her worth in those moments. She acknowledged the feelings, gave them space to visit, then let them pass without setting up residence. She and Mama Beezy grew close in a way that wasn't loud or overly sentimental. They shared stories during sewing breaks, laughed at the ridiculousness of some customer requests, and sat in silence when there was nothing to say. One afternoon, as they folded clothes together, Mama Beezy looked at her and said, "You hold your peace like a woman twice your age." Grace smiled, not because she agreed, but because she appreciated the observation. Peace was not something she had found. It was something she had built, day by day, moment by moment, out of every time she chose herself over the fear of being alone. She received the occasional message from Chica, who remained her anchor from afar, always checking in without hovering. Noah still called every Sunday, their conversations easy, flowing like water over smooth stones. There was no declaration between them, no need to label what they were or weren't. But there was trust, and sometimes that was more powerful than any confession. One evening, Grace returned from the market and noticed a small envelope tucked under her pillow. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tight, slanted, slightly hesitant. Inside was a short letter from Rosalind. It was not poetic or warm. The words were clipped, sparse, filled with pride even in their attempt at softness. "I hear you are managing on your own. That's good. You always liked doing things your way. I'm not angry anymore. Just be careful. Life is not kind to women who think they don't need anyone." There was no apology, no affection, but there was something in the way the words were chosen, a kind of clumsy acknowledgement that Grace had not failed, despite all her mother's predictions. She folded the note, placed it in her drawer, and sat for a long time, staring out the window. She didn't cry. She didn't feel vindicated. If anything, she felt a soft sadness for the mother who had never learned how to love gently, who had mistaken control for protection. But Grace had made peace with the idea that some people would never change, and that didn't mean she had to carry their weight forever. She still thought of her mother sometimes, especially in the quiet spaces between busy hours. She still remembered the harsh words, the nights she lay awake trying to erase them from her memory. But now, those thoughts no longer controlled her. They visited like old songs, familiar, sometimes haunting, but no longer on repeat. That letter, however incomplete, marked a shift. A closing of a chapter not with triumph, but with quiet acceptance. And sometimes that's the most honest kind of ending. On her birthday that year, Grace did something she had never done before. She celebrated herself. She didn't throw a party or gather a crowd. Instead, she bought herself a small cake from a local bakery, lit a single candle, and sat on the balcony with a glass of cold water, watching the stars emerge above the rooftops. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who begged silently to be loved, who flinched at raised voices, who stayed when she should have run. She thought about Darren, about her mother, about all the places where she had been cracked open, reshaped. And then, she thought about the people who had gently helped her stitch herself back together. Chica, Noah, Mama Beezy, the children at the center. She didn't need grand declarations to feel full. She didn't need anyone to remind her of how far she had come. She could feel it in her bones, in her breath, in the way her heart no longer raced at every sudden sound. She made a silent wish before blowing out the candle. Not for love, not for success, not even for happiness. She wished only for courage, the courage to keep choosing herself, even when it was hard. And as the wind swept away the smoke and the night deepened, she leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the quiet with gratitude. In that moment, Grace was not just surviving. She was living. Not loudly, not perfectly, but truthfully. And for the first time in her life, that was more than enough. Dear listener, no matter where you're coming from or what you've survived, please know this. Your past does not define your future. You are not the names they called you. You are not the pain you endured. You are more than the silence you were forced into. You have the right to heal. You have the right to grow. You have the right to be loved gently, to be heard, and most importantly, to love yourself without apology. Don't let the wounds others gave you become the reason you stay small. You are allowed to leave the pain behind. You are allowed to walk into peace. And if no one has told you this lately, you are worth it. Heavenly Father, for every listener whose heart has been bruised, for every soul that has walked through rejection, abuse, or silence, I speak healing. May every broken place be rebuilt with strength. May every tear sown in secret return with joy. For the ones still afraid to speak, Lord, give them a voice. For the ones still tied to their past, cut every invisible chain. Let peace flood their minds like a calm river after a storm. Let self-love rise in their hearts like the morning sun. May they attract the right people, walk into safe spaces, and build lives that reflect their true worth. and may they never again confuse pain with love, nor silence with strength. From this day forward, may your journey be lighter, your heart be stronger, and your spirit be free. In Jesus' name, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.